Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 667 of People Behind the Science. Today, we are excited to be resharing our conversation with Dr. James, or JC, Cahill, originally released on January 30th of 2015. Now, in his career, JC has been working on a variety of interesting fundamental questions in the area of plant ecology, including questions related to biodiversity, herbivory, plant social interactions, and climate change. He is particularly interested in how individual plants interact in their pursuit of food and how plant communities respond to environmental changes such as climate change. So listeners, get ready to learn a little and get inspired by JC in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am excited to be here today with Dr. JC Cahill. So welcome to our show, JC. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. We are delighted to chat with you about your journey and your experiences. Now, listeners, JC is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Alberta. He received his PhD in biology from the University of Pennsylvania, and afterward, he served briefly as a visiting assistant professor at Ursinus College and then on the faculty at the University of Delaware before joining the faculty at the University of Alberta, where he has been for about 15 years now. And JC is here with us today to share his scientific and life experiences with us. So today, JC, we want to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you take a few minutes here just to give us an idea of what you like to do with your time when you're not doing science?
Sure. I have a lovely wife, Colleen, who's also a biologist in the department. She studies animal behavior. And between the two of us, we have 4 kids, all of whom are teenagers. So a good chunk of our daily life is dealing with a bunch of teenager-related activities, which is a lot of fun.
Of course.
And struggles. But that's a good chunk of it. But also that I play a lot of tennis. I like to cook and generally just play games and music with the family.
Wonderful. So what kind of music and games are you into?
Oh, a little bit of everything. With the age group that I am and they are, we certainly play a lot of video games, but we also play lots of board games, strategy, card type games. And music, my wife used to be quite a proficient bassoonist in a different life, and so she's quite good with music, and I strum a guitar every now and then.
Well, that sounds lovely. You guys can do your little guitar bassoon duets.
That's
sounds
correct.
Fantastic. Well, I know myself and my husband both play instruments, so we've got the violin piano duets that come out about every Christmas or so.
Oh, that's nice.
Well, wonderful to hear about how you spend your time when you're not at work. And we also like to hear about your scientific side as well. So next, can you tell us a little bit about your work side? How do you describe what you do to someone who might not be in science?
Sure. I'm an ecologist, so I tend to study interactions of organisms with each other in the environment, and my particular focus is on plants. And in particular, I'm interested in trying to understand how plants interact with each other and in their pursuit for food. So plant foraging and competition sorts of interactions. As I've been in this job for 15 years or so, the lab and research questions get broader and broader. So I study a lot of community ecology, which is looking at the different types of species that are found in certain locations. And I study communities in the context of issues such as climate change or invasive species or drought, tend to be things of more immediate societal concern. So quite a big mixture.
Very interesting. Well, great to hear that you get a little bit of variety in your day-to-day work, studying different things. Absolutely. So with all of this work that you're trying to get done in the laboratory and in the field and all these things that you're trying to balance, the teenagers at home, your hobbies, things like that, I always wonder how people get it all done in a day. So JC, do you have a particular motivational quote or maybe a saying, a mantra that you keep in your mind as you go through it all?
Well, actually, in the lab we do. I have a general lab motto, which my graduate students can't stand, but it's don't worry, it's going to work out. And I say this over and over with each student who comes in and over the course of their program, not because I'm trying to imply that things are easy or just leave it alone and it's going to solve itself, but instead the idea is to help them have a positive framework of what's going to happen in the future. And hopefully then once they realize it's going to work out, if they can let themselves believe that, all they have to do is figure out how to make that happen. They already know the outcome. Now they just have to do the logistics in between. Eventually, I think it's a positive thing for the lab. It keeps it a lighter atmosphere, but it's definitely one that I keep in my head and I say over and over the course of their degrees.
Well, that is a wonderful lab motto. I love that. Everything's going to be okay kind of mentality. Right. And I think that's one of the least reassuring things, I think, to hear when you're stressed out. You're like, how can you say it's going to be okay? But I think you're absolutely right.
Well, I say it with a big smile, so hopefully that helps.
Yeah. Calm everyone down. I love that. Right. Well, that is an excellent motto for the lab and for science in general. I think as long as you stay the course, you're perseverant, you work hard, everything is going to be okay. Everything's going to work out. So great motto to take with you every day. And can you tell us now a little bit about some of the people who may have inspired you? So maybe someone who imparted this motto on you throughout your career and throughout your years, people who've been role models and inspirational to you.
I come from a family where education was always really important. My grandfather was a small town family physician in rural Ohio, and his kids, so my father and uncles and aunts, grew up with education. My father's a PhD in microbiology. My mother's a clinical psychologist. And so it always made sense to study science. It was around me all the time. And so that was my mindset going in. But I didn't really know what that meant when I entered college. I went to Trinity College in Connecticut, a small liberal arts college. And one of the great things about that school is it is a small enrollment school where there's a lot of personal interactions with the professors. And I ended up in the lab of Craig Schneider. He's a seaweed biologist. And I didn't have great grades. I never had great grades throughout my life. I was a B student at the time, but I've always been really good at solving problems and fairly adept in solving scientific questions. And he took me into the lab, which I was extremely grateful for. And he helped me see what the job of a scientist was, as well as the job of a professor. And it was really a transformative stage in my career, is realizing that there are jobs out there where you can be genuinely curious about something. And as long as you get the money, do solid work, and think hard and work hard, that's a life. I mean, and it's really a great luxury to spend most of my time thinking and trying to learn things nobody else has known ever before.
Certainly. Well, it's very interesting to hear about these early stages in your career, and fascinating to hear people who describe that they were not the best students or were not necessarily that excited about school to begin with. And I think that's more common than a lot of people realize in people who are very successful scientists. You don't have to be that straight A student, that person that aced every organic chemistry exam to be successful in science. So it's reassuring to hear you say this.
Oh, absolutely. I actually just had a lab meeting this morning, and this came up at the lab meeting. I was leading a discussion in the group of actually how do you prepare a lecture? One of those things that you never really talk about in grad school. And
right.
I wish I had that when I was a student. So that was the theme of today's discussion. And the focus was that you have this diverse group of students in the classroom that you need to deal with to make it good for all of them. And I had a series of very frustrated teachers as a child where I clearly had some capacities for understanding and analytical thought, but I was just a B student at best, and often less than a B student. And my grades coming out of college were fine. I was a 3.2 student as my GPA, which is lower than the minimum required for even to be considered to be a graduate student in the program I now teach in. So my grades in no way reflected my ability to do science, which I think is more of a problem of education than anything else. But absolutely, students who have capacity to do science and think creatively can do quite well, regardless of what the initial GPA is.
Well, great to hear, like I said. And I'm interested to hear now, when did you decide that you were interested in pursuing a career in science? Or when did you initially become interested in this and start pursuing it?
Well, as coming out of high school, I, like most high school students, viewed science as medicine, and I didn't realize the nuances of what science really was. And so I applied to Trinity. I was actually as a philosophy major who was intent on going to medical school, so not exactly a traditional path. And I soon realized at Trinity that I didn't really want to be around sick people my whole life. Mm-hmm. That just didn't sound fun. And at that same time, I was able to get involved with Craig Schneider in biology and learn more about what science actually is. But even in college, I actually never took an ecology class. I've never taken a formal course in ecology. until I got to graduate school. But I knew enough about the types of questions in the different disciplines to realize that this issue of complexity that ecology deals with is an area that I was probably well suited for.
Very interesting. Well, great to hear about your path and what really turned you then on to biology, kind of getting that experience in the laboratory, doing science yourself. And then very interesting to hear that you didn't take an ecology course until graduate school. That is phenomenal. So you were definitely a late bloomer, I think, in selecting your field.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. But interesting to hear a lot of the people that I've talked to started on this path of being interested in the pre-med route and then at some point shifting towards research and becoming fascinated by another aspect of biology. So interesting to hear that this was the case with you as well. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're working on today? One of these projects that you are just so excited about.
Sure, a bunch of different things. So my main active research right now sort of is broken into two areas. One of them is plant behavioral ecology. So this is where I'm trying to apply concepts of animal behavior, such as foraging and choice and information integration, to plants. And it's a really interesting area because the more we do experiments trying to see what plants are able to do, knowing that they don't have a brain, they don't have cognition, they don't have those things that we do, the more we realize that their actions mimic the choices that cognitive animals make. In other words, we see this complexity in what animals do and assume you need a brain to do it, but plants do very, very similar things. And so this is a fun area of research because there's just not a lot of work done here, but it's also breaking traditional boundaries that likely were constructed not because of biological need, but instead just human social history of dividing plants and animals for no good reason in terms of how they interact with the environment. So on that side right now, I'm working on a couple fun papers where I'm trying to essentially reconceptualize what behavior is if we ignore taxonomic barriers. And so sort of just, it's a thought exercise of what do we really mean for behavior to be. And I'm doing this in collaboration with some colleagues here who are hardcore animal behaviorists from the physiological side. So I'm getting to learn quite a lot.
Very interesting. Yeah. So what is one of the most surprising or impressive behaviors that you've seen in plants?
Well, one of the big ones is we had a paper published a couple of years ago where we're showing that plants are able to integrate different pieces of information, specifically where food is and where their neighbor roots are. So they're able to use spatial information about food and enemies in a way that has them alter their own root growth to occupy the soil differently than you would expect if they only had one of those two pieces of information. So it's not the classic idea that plant growth is deterministic, that they go here and that's how it is, but really there's this contingency based on really subtle differences in the environment that somehow plants have a way of combining pieces of information to affect a response that we assume you need a brain for. Information integration is a pretty sophisticated thing, and we just don't know much about this. We know none of the physiology of this.
Fascinating. Well, was there another project you were going to mention?
Yeah, so that's one of the big ones. The other area is I've always studied a lot of competition, which is not too surprising. I'm a football player, lots of sports. So, competition sort of has been the other major theme of life, which is very common in people who study competition. And right now we're looking at some chemicals in leaves that have traditionally been viewed as ways of preventing the leaves from being eaten by insects. So as a plant defense chemical. And the more we're studying it, the more we're realizing that these defenses maybe are more important for actually impacting competitive interactions in the soil once those chemicals come out of the leaves. And so we're, again, trying to break down these boundaries between these feeding relationships of the insects on the leaves and the feeding relationships of the plants with competitive interactions, and see this as more of an integrated system instead of artificial barriers.
Well, that is a very intriguing research project. And I love that you mentioned as you're studying competition, you are one of these competitive people.
Absolutely.
So that is wonderful to hear. Well, very interesting to hear about these particular projects that you're working on. And I think so far we've really painted a wonderful picture of your journey through science to get to where you are today. And we haven't yet chatted really about some of these challenges that I know every scientist faces. And these challenges may come in a variety of different forms, but I think every scientist, when they look back over their careers, remember periods of struggle or maybe when they had major failures. Can you share one of these difficult periods periods with us today and how you got through it.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask about this question of these major failures. And to be honest, this has been one of the hardest things for me to come up with a clear response to. I look back over my career and I can see a number of personal failures that I've made, struggles with kids or a marriage that didn't work out or not always interacting with my extended family, the normal, part of being human.
Right. All the human regrets.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I can get that in spades. No problem there. The professional one, I have a hard time with. I can look back to when I was a new professor and I was untenured, and I was struggling with the workload of trying to figure out how do you move from being a graduate student to actually being a mentor of graduate students in a meaningful way, and how do you learn to write better and quicker and all of these things. But I've just been fortunate not to have many failures there, or I just don't consider the bumps as failures. I have lots of experiments that I set up that don't get the anticipated results, and maybe half of them. The rodents in the field eat all of my seeds, and so we don't get any data. But even those I don't consider failures as much as sort of just the cost of research. It doesn't always work out, but you do enough and you keep doing it as well as you can, and you get results. And a key is always to frame the research questions in a way that you're not dependent upon the answer. It doesn't matter if the answer is a positive or negative in terms of the research question, as long as the question itself is of value. Then all answers are successes, as long as the experiment completes.
Very interesting perspective. I love this almost optimism that you have going into it. I think that's something that a lot of scientists get beaten down during these difficult periods, especially this one that you're mentioning, the start of your first faculty position, where you're trying to juggle the workload, all these things that you're trying to get going, as well as making the lectures, getting your lab started, getting everything going, recruiting students. There's so much to do that it is a really difficult period for people, but it sounds like you were able to get through that without much challenge.
Well, I wouldn't say it was without challenge as much as I'm choosing not to view that challenge as failure.
Certainly.
Being a professional scientist in a large academic university, it's a really hard job in the sense of the stress. And you always are pursuing money, and rightly so. Society should not just give me an unlimited checkbook. That wouldn't be a prudent use of taxpayer dollars. I wouldn't ask for that. And so I need to justify my research questions before I get funded. I'm good with that. But the other part is, my lab group and many other lab groups that you talk with, we're all trying to genuinely push back the boundaries of science. And we're trying to learn things that are simply unknown, which means we're working at the edges of knowledge. And that's an extremely stressful place to be, because it's so easy to have self-doubt. It's so easy to try to be cautious, and it's easy to make choices that decrease the impact of the work. And at the same time, we're trying to publish in the best journals possible so that they have the best potential impact for moving science forward. And that's just harder than publishing in journals that have less stringent peer review. And so we encounter failure and rejection almost on a daily basis. And I personally find that if I focus on those negative aspects of the job, this would be a miserable life.
Right.
And said, I know I have those hardships and I know I have those challenges, but I don't have to take them as negatives. That's just part of the job. And, my kids are great and the family's great, and we just have as much fun as we can.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a great perspective to take on it. I mean, I've talked to a lot of scientists about the different challenges, and having done research myself, I know it's not easy, but you talk to people like yourself, and there's a number of other folks I've talked with who just have this winning attitude, really is the best way I can describe it. Maybe it comes from your competitive nature, where you don't see these challenges as something to be upset about. You're ready to embrace them. You go out there, you meet them, and you do your best. And I think that's really all we can ask of scientists out there, going out there, doing your best every day, and sort of being creative and adaptive when these challenges come along. So great to hear about one of these difficult periods and some of the different struggles that you've had as a scientist. But we don't just want to talk about the tough times, JC. Can you tell us next about one of these success stories, a happy time from your career or from your own lab?
Sure. I'm not a new professor anymore, and so I've had, maybe a dozen graduate students have gotten PhDs or masters out of my labs, and some postdocs have moved through. And so most of my most immediate positive success stories that come to my mind are the students moving on with their lives in a way that they want to move on. I had a couple graduate students just this last year who got tenure track job offers. One of my early PhDs just got tenure. So I feel really good about that, in that I know that at worst, I didn't mess up their life.
Right.
And it's very possible that their time here actually helped them achieve some of the life goals that they have. And I find that really, really rewarding, much more than any specific research finding. Just knowing that I'm genuinely helping people, and also undergraduates. I have lots of undergraduates in my lab. We do research and help them develop really strong research programs, which is what I had as an undergraduate. And it's great to see how many of them end up moving into graduate school or professional school. So that's the really positive part on the job. In terms of the actual research front, the two areas that I really am having fun with, and I'm happy to see the feedback that's coming, one of them is the plant behavior work. And so on this studies of plant behavior, I happened to be in a nature documentary not that long ago, talking about plant behavior and how we could rethink what plants are, and showing some people's work. The feedback I've gotten from the public has just been incredible. I've given talks and been invited to give talks to native plant societies and horticultural societies all over the place. And I get emails. Every time a rerun airs, I get 100 emails or so about this. And it's really gratifying to see part of my formal research program actually resonating with people who are interested in science, similar to probably the audience of your podcast. And so that's a great reward. On the pure research side, that's fun too. There's an area I decided to test a research question related to origin of species. And so in the origin, Darwin argues that more closely related species should compete more strongly with each other than they do more distantly related species. So it's a specific prediction he made that turned out to be a really important prediction or hypothesis, so important that early ecologists never tested it. Because Darwin said it, it must be true. And so this whole initial field of community ecology was built upon Darwin's line being true. A few years back, my group decided to do the first real test of it. And we didn't actually find support for Darwin.
Oh, no.
Well, and it was really hard to publish initially. Talk about the rejection period. It's one of the toughest papers to get published I've ever had. It turns out, though, that we asked that question right before other groups were beginning to ask the same question. And so this is one of those places where we just got ahead of everybody else for who knows why. And since then, there have been dozens and dozens of tests following up on our work. And so this whole subfield has developed. And it feels really good to have helped open up that door to moving the edges of science back. And the fact that most of them tend to be supporting our work is great too, but that's less important than the fact that this was a question that people realized had to be answered and that they're testing it independently.
Certainly. Well, those are some phenomenal successes that you went through with us today, JC. I mean, I think having that impact on undergraduate and graduate students and helping shape their careers is one of the things that a lot of scientists really look forward to in the career. And definitely this connection with the public about your plant behavior work, getting them excited about it, getting them engaged. I think great success there, and phenomenal to hear you talk about going back and testing one of these longstanding assumptions. I think there are more of these in the world of science than a lot of people realize, things that you just assume are true because you've assumed it for so long. Why not, But going back and testing those things. Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. That's been basically how I've made my career over my entire academic life, is go back to the older literature, find out what are the core principles that most people agree on, and test those, because the odds are pretty good they've never been tested.
Certainly. Well, fantastic successes that you've shared with us today. And I think some really interesting variety in those successes as a scientist, things that you look forward to, things that you enjoy about the career. And I think a lot of scientists stay so busy with the research that they're doing, trying to juggle all the other things in their life. They don't always have time to do all the things that they love. And one of the things that I think often falls on the wayside when I talk to scientists is reading. But I've gotten some phenomenal book recommendations from the scientists I've been chatting with. So can you share a book recommendation with us today? One of these books that you've read that you've really enjoyed and you think our listeners would like to check out.
Sadly, I don't do a lot of non-work related reading. I follow the news a lot of political reading, those sorts of things. The most recent book I read is an old tennis book called Winning Ugly.
Ooh.
The mental side of tennis, which is a great book and a lot of fun. Again, going back to the competition theme. But for me, really, reading and writing is my job. And I don't tend to view it as recreation. And similarly, I work with plants on a daily basis, and I can't stand to garden.
Really?
I love my job, but that's not what I do for fun outside of the job. I need a way of just having a different life. It doesn't mean I think less about the work I do, but I don't want my work life to be in every tendril of everything else I do in my work.
Absolutely. I like that. A well-rounded person. You've got your interest in plants at work, but then you have other interests outside of work as well.
That's right.
So do you have a particular science or plant-related book that you'd recommend?
No, but I love A Little Shop of Horrors, the Rick Moranis movie and off-Broadway play. If I'm going to watch that sort of thing, I tend to recreate that way. Lots of movies.
Gotcha. Well, fantastic recommendation. I know I'm familiar with that Little Shop of Horrors play myself, so we'll put that out there for our listeners to check out on our website. And I know talking to scientists, there are a lot of wonderful things about the career. We talked about a lot of the rewarding successes that you've had, your exciting journey to get to where you are today. And I think one of the other aspects about careers in science that a lot of people get excited about are some of the opportunities that you get to travel, to see the world. And these opportunities come in many different forms, maybe fieldwork, conferences, things like that. Can you think back now, JC, on all of these places that you have traveled for science? And can you share with us today your favorite place? And what was it about this place that really made it memorable for you?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A big part of the job is travel. And with younger kids, I always tried to restrict that so I wasn't away from home for too much. Didn't want to put too much burden on my wife. So I've limited that. And in my own fieldwork, actually, I tend to do locally. I made a pragmatic choice early on to keep most of my research not too far from my house so that I didn't have to take away from my family life to do my work life. And so I've traded off on that front. But in terms of conferences, that's where a lot of the travel comes. I had the opportunity to spend actually 6 weeks in Holland a while back, and I just loved the Netherlands, and particularly Amsterdam. The museums, the architecture, it's my favorite city I've been to, and it was just spectacular. And last year, I had the opportunity to spend a week in London at a big conference with my oldest son at the time. And that was quite special too. It was the last summer before he was to go off to university. And again, the museums, the history, and that tends to be what I really enjoy in the travel. It's get to experience the cultural history of the places I get to go to.
Certainly. Well, those sound like phenomenal travel opportunities. Now, you mentioned Holland. What was the occasion for going to Holland for 6 weeks?
I had a sabbatical, and I knew I wasn't going to be away for a year, but I was able to visit a colleague for 6 weeks or so and do a little bit of traveling while I was there. So it was sort of a compromise sabbatical.
Certainly. Well, that sounds like an outstanding opportunity. Was there one particular site that really sticks out in your mind when you think back about that trip?
That's a really good question. What I like to do when I go traveling to cities I've never been before is essentially just walk around. And so I spent in Amsterdam essentially the weekend just walking. And when I went to Bruges, the same thing. I spent the 2 days just walking around the city. So it was really getting to see as much as I can and stopping at the cafes and going to the museums here and there, but really just to be in the place that's different rather than see one thing in particular.
Definitely. Well, I agree with you there. I'm definitely a stroller when I go to a city. I just want to walk the streets. I don't want to drive around. I don't want to get on the subway. I just want to walk there. So definitely makes you feel more a part of the city as you're walking down the streets, kind of getting immersed in the culture. I love it. So great to hear about some of these opportunities that you've had to travel, to see the world for different things. And I think you brought up a really great point here that a lot of scientists struggle with, this kind of balancing their family life with travel. And was this something that you were finding particularly problematic, especially when you were talking about having children? Were you turning down conferences, things like that?
Oh, absolutely. And I still turn them down. Work-related travel can take a lot of time. You know, if you give a talk at a conference, that's essentially a week. And it's not always a great use of my work time. It usually will come at the cost of something else. Am I meeting less often with students? Am I writing a little less? And I don't want it to come at the cost of my family life. And so it is this delicate balancing act between what I want to do, what I need to do professionally, and what the costs are. And it's a constant struggle. I made a choice in my research career to try to have a whole life, as opposed to try to maximize one part of my life. And that means that, you know, I won't publish as many papers as I could if I made different choices, nor would I have all of the time with the family that I would if I made different choices. But I'm the middle path I'm trying to find, but it's hard.
Certainly. Well, I think it's great to hear you say these things. I mean, I think some of the people that I've spoken to, you know, they're traveling up to a third of the year, maybe even half of the year doing field work away from their family, things like that. It is great to hear from other scientists who have a balanced approach to life, who've made these decisions and are still very successful as scientists. So great for our listeners to hear as well, who might be on this journey trying to figure out what they want their life to be like as a scientist and if it's possible.
Yeah, there's definitely more than one way to solve the problem.
Absolutely. Well, JC, I think when you think back about your career in science, I think a lot of things that really jump to people's minds are some of the people that they've had an opportunity to work with, some of these lab groups you've been a part of, maybe in your PhD work, in your postdoc work, and these different positions that you've had. And I think when you put that many brilliant, creative, and enthusiastic people together, you get some quirky traditions that spring up a lot of times, or even just funny memories that you can look back and laugh about. And I think sharing these experiences with people is a really key component of an enjoyable life as a scientist. So can you share maybe one of these memories or one of these quirky traditions with us today?
Well, I think that most people will probably suggest that they themselves have no quirky traditions.
Of course. I've heard this.
And they only come up you ask somebody else. So I imagine me, like all of my friends, we're perfectly normal people. We just happen to be, a funny group of people to compare against. So, my lab, we do study competition. So every now and then we'll be the group that goes out and challenges other lab groups to some soccer match or something, or organizing a sports day for the whole ecology group on campus. And not horribly quirky, but we do. I have a hard time saying anything in particular that way. We socialize a lot, try to have a lot of fun, but we're also a fairly intense group of people focused on work when we're in the office. And that works out pretty well. But we're also able to talk about not just the research side, but we do talk about a lot of the socio-political side of science, and in an effort to help people understand that whole world that they're trying to enter. And so it's quirky in the sense that most lab groups don't do it, but I think it's critically important to helping students get where they want to be.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a great point. And I think it's interesting talking to a lot of different scientists. You see a lot of people do have this work hard, play hard kind of mentality where they're very serious. They work very hard in lab, put in a lot of hours, but they also have fun. They do different activities to relieve the stress, to enjoy the company of their lab mates. And I really like that you are able to have these sort of scientific but not scientific discussions at the same time with your students to prepare them for what's to come. So I think very important. Now, you mentioned a book about tennis. Do you have a particular sport of choice when you're competing?
Right now it's tennis. Before that it was squash. Before that it was fencing, and I go through waves. But right now it's tennis. I'm playing a lot of that. In fact, I have a tournament later this evening, so that's definitely my focus right now.
Gotcha. Well, good luck in the tournament. I'm sure you'll do well. Well, great to hear about one of these traditions that you have in your lab, the things that you guys do when you're maybe not working so hard on science, enjoying each other's company, a little bit of a friendly sport there. I like it. Now, I know researchers, in addition to talking about research that they've done over the course of their years, I like to hear these big burning research questions that you would love to answer. And oftentimes there are things standing in the way, things like funding or staff or technology or even feasibility. Can you tell us, if we took all of those restrictions away, JC, what is one of these big burning research questions that you and your lab group are just dying to know the answer to?
Yeah, one of the areas I'm trying to get to is understanding how a plant chooses to use space. What I mean by this is putting its organs, its roots and things into the soil. How does it integrate all of the information about its enemies, be they insects or microbes or other plants, to alter the movement and position of roots in the soil? I'm interested in this because it has all these implications for coexistence and agricultural productivity and a variety of other areas. But this core question of how does a plant decide where to live just isn't solved. And it hasn't really been asked in that way until the last couple of years. So we're moving there. I don't actually think that funding is a problem, or technology or feasibility or any of these other ideas. But I think that's my optimism, is that of course I need money, but if the question is good, you'll get money. And if the technologies aren't available, well, we'll just create them. If we need a new way of observing roots in the soil, which is what we do, which is actually quite hard to do, well, let's just modify what exists to let us do what we need to do. And so I sort of see part of the fun of the puzzle solving is not to let yourself feel limited by technology or these other advantages. Of course, it would be easier if I could automatically see in the soil and see roots grow over time, but that's not possible. So how do I answer the really important questions with what's available? And so it's fun.
You're very practical. This is coming through. Well, I'm one of these people myself. I like to constrain myself within this realm of possibility and think about these research questions. And I think you're absolutely right. If you have one of these brilliant research questions, there's always a way to solve it. You will get the funding if you put together a compelling proposal. You will be able to build the technology if you sort of design the question in a way that you can answer it. So I think those are really great points to bring up here, and certainly a really interesting question to be working towards and think within your own research now. So phenomenal to talk about some of these big questions that scientists are thinking about. And I think in addition to brainstorming about the next big question your lab is going to tackle or some of the directions that your research is going, I think a lot of scientists, we talk about life in general. And I think through this, you get a lot of advice that you share with your students, and then advice coming to you from your different mentors, your colleagues, things like that over the course of your career. So can you tell us, JC, today, what is one of the best pieces of advice that you think that you have ever received?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to have a lot of people looking out for me early in my career, even if I didn't know that, and helping me in what seemed like small ways to sort of rethink things that I was doing. And it really has made a difference in how I approach my life. And a few of the things that I constantly refer back to is one thing I heard early on is everything is negotiable. And it sounds like it's this business strategy that, I'm trying to maximize personal advantage. But instead, what it really means is that in a university academic system, any problem can be solved if you have the right argument and know who to talk to. And it doesn't mean they're doing you favors, but instead, university administration loves to support success. And if you can show success, they're going to help you be more successful. And so that made me realize that what I might perceive as a roadblock in the university is probably just a function that I didn't realize what I needed to do to move forward. And so that's really helped me not feel limited. One of the other things I really come back to is in my first year, a great friend and colleague, John Adicott, was in the department. And I had my first undergraduate in the lab. And she was brilliant, way smarter than I was. It was clear to her, it was clear to me that she was way smarter than I was. I come across that all the time. And she did an honors research project with me, and it was a horrible failure. And this actually was a failure. The experiment was poorly conceived. It just didn't work out. And I was sort of despondent of this horrible experience right at the start of my career. And I talked to John about this. And what he emphasized to me is that you need to learn to mentor students not by assuming they think and act like you do or you would have at that age, but you have to treat everybody as completely different individuals. And it seems obvious, but we don't get that training in graduate school. And realizing that everybody's slight mental shifts, your own as well as your students, and goals and aspirations, they all really influence what is and isn't effective in helping them get forward in their lives. And that was a pivotal early stage piece of information that has really helped me and later students in my lab quite a lot. I don't have a single cookie cutter that I try to put people through.
Certainly. Well, I think those are both exceptional pieces of advice to get in your career. I mean, I think certainly this idea of everything is negotiable. I really like that. And I think it emphasizes the importance of collaboration and networking within your university to get things done, to solve these problems rather than just kind of brushing them off saying, oh, we can't do that because of blaming someone else. So I really like that piece of advice. And I like this humility that you bring to the table in talking about this undergraduate student project that just didn't go well. And I think this focus on personalized mentorship is really important for faculty members. You can't treat every student exactly the same because everyone learns differently. Everyone is at a different stage in terms of their scientific growth and where they want to go afterwards. So really, really great point to bring up. Now, is there any other last piece of advice, JC, or maybe a last piece of inspiration that you want to leave our listeners with today, now coming from you personally?
Sure. So I'm a practicing scientist at a large university. And like I said earlier, that's a really stressful job. You have no boss. Your job expectations are put upon you by yourself, which is often a very, very dangerous thing. And every stage of the research process is competitive. But this is the best job in the world. I really love what I do, and I wouldn't give this up for anything. So you work through that, and there's a lot to really enjoy in a daily way in this job.
Absolutely. Well, I think that well suits your optimistic and your competitive nature. So great to hear. A wonderful piece of inspiration to leave our listeners with today. Now, can you tell them how they can reach out to learn a little bit more about you or the research that you're doing?
Sure. The easiest way to get a hold of me is just send me an email. My email is jc.cahill at ualberta, ualberta.ca. And I'm happy to take emails from your listeners and happy to respond.
Well, that is great. JC, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed our conversation as well. And listeners, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.